All right, it's 11 o'clock, and we're excited to present another in this series of the Renaissance Masters. And Harry, would you please begin?
Well, welcome everybody in the classroom. We have a nice turnout here and at home. And as you can see, I've put a picture of a young Michelangelo on the screen to illustrate my approach in this case, which is the work that mostly he's done while he's under 40. It's remarkable. He lives to be older than most of us, even in this room, actually. And yet he certainly does a lot of work after the age of 40, but he's really dramatic things that he does, like David in the Sistine Chapel, are done in his late 30s. So have a seat over there if you're coming in. Unlike Leonardo, Michelangelo was very contentious, and maybe you can't tell that from this picture. Whereas Leonardo was handsome, urbane, eloquent, well-dressed. The neurotic Michelangelo was intense, disheveled, and irascible, as we'll see with anybody, popes to the lowest person working for him. Both men were gay, but Leonardo was comfortable having male companions, as I talked about a little bit last week, whereas Michelangelo was tormented and imposed celibacy on himself. He lived a life of torment that way, in other ways. My delight is in melancholy, he once just confessed. He was a favorite artist of Pope Julius II, and they had a love-hate relationship, which you'll see again. Most people bowed to popes, but not Michelangelo. This is a picture of Michelangelo's birthplace in Caprese, which is near Arezzo, as you can see from the map in the upper right-hand corner. It's sort of part of Tuscany, over on the right-hand side, and Caprese is near there. So that Florence is going to be a natural place for Michelangelo to start and to begin his career. You can see a picture of the museum on the lower left-hand corner. Michelangelo, again, unlike Leonardo, was born into a family that for several generations belonged to minor nobility. But by the time he was born, his father had lost his patrimony and status, but his father spent most of his life trying to regain the kind of status that his family had had. Michelangelo, of course, didn't care. Michelangelo's father had been mayor of Caprese for a while, and he held occasional government jobs. At the time of Michelangelo's birth, he was the administrator of a small independent town of Caprese. So he unlike Leonardo, of course, it was illegitimate. Michelangelo has some position as his career begins. His father arranged for him to be apprenticed to Florence's most prominent painter, a man named Domenico Ghirlandaio, a master, as I said on the board here, of frescoes and the most popular painter in Florence at this point. So he starts out as a painter. Of course, he considers himself ultimately a sculptor, and of course, most of his big works are sculptures, but he is initially a painter. Ghirlandaio he stays with for 3 years. That was the agreement, but he leaves after 1 year because he said, "I have nothing more to learn," which tells you something about him also. Many apprentices have passed through Ghirlandaio's workshop, so he was well known as a sort of a way of cultivating the young artists. Ghirlandaio's Last Supper is down here at the bottom, and you can see the more traditional view of it, as I showed you last week, with Judas sitting on the other side of the table and the rest of the disciples grouped in various places around the table. And it shows you some perspective, but it's not the really dramatic way that Leonardo has changed things. Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, asked Ghirlandaio to send him art students of particular promise. And that's where, again, where Michelangelo is going to get a big break. He was taken under the wing or into the household of Lorenzo de' Medici, who surrounds himself, as I talked about a couple of weeks ago, with poets and intellectuals and a very sort of elite, educated group of artists and speakers. And Michelangelo sits at the dinner table as a young teenager, listening to these people holding forth. He roams the various gardens of Lorenzo's estate, as you can see down below, and he at that point discovers sculpture. And this is what he says, I'm going to make my real career with. And so he begins to shift over to sculpture from painting as he no longer lives with Lorenzo. This is this head of a faun, which is a lost sculpture by Michelangelo dating from 1489. It's when work in marble. It was done when he was 15 or 16 as a copy of an antique work with some minor alterations. So he's 15 or 16 when he chisels this old piece of marble into a faun who becomes a satyr. Lorenzo said the faun looked so old that Michelangelo, he said, make him look even older. So Michelangelo knocked out some of his teeth, which I'm not interested in approach. But according to Vasari's biography of the artist, it was the creation of this work that secured by Michelangelo the patronage of Lorenzo de' Medici almost forever, for as long as Lorenzo lived, which won't be that much longer. Michelangelo's father, however, is very upset that his son has become a sculptor because he considers a sculptor being sort of a stone cutter. He thinks it's beneath him. It's not socially respectable enough at a time when Michelangelo's family is trying to sort of reestablish themselves. So his father's disappointed in this until Michelangelo really begins to have such a successful career. Here's a picture of Michelangelo showing Lorenzo, Il Magnifico, the head of a faun. And you can see from this picture here, there is Lorenzo in the middle, here, right there, Michelangelo right here showing him the head of the faun, and various others of Lorenzo's entourage around, surrounding him in the hills of Tuscany in the background. Sort of a marvelous picture, which is painted in the 19th century. It's nothing to do with, not done in Michelangelo's time. Michelangelo has drawn on his imagination to add the features that were missing in this antique model of a nose and an open mouth as of a man laughing. This head of a faun, which you can see in the picture in front of you. Lorenzo praises Michelangelo's work, good-naturedly criticizing that it was unlikely, as I said before, a man that old would have all of his teeth. So that's why Michelangelo knocks out some of the front teeth of the faun. Ghirlandaio, now he's still working in his studio, and he says, go to the marketplace and see everything as an object for art. Go look around, get your hands dirty, look and see what the place looks like. And he goes down, there's a picture of a marketplace in Florence at that point, and he does some sketching, as you can see here, of the head of a fish. Ghirlandaio says, keep your eyes open. Study the sizes and hues of the fish that are being sold there. I mean, it seems very minor or menial, but that's the way you learn to draw. Reproduce them in drawings. And Lorenzo more and more treats Michelangelo as his son. As I said, he lives and eats with the family, and he gets a little full of himself. Pretty cocky kid for a 15, 16-year-old at this point, and he's going to have a comeuppance. Comeuppance is at 17, one of his artists, he and a co-artist have a fight. And this guy, I just showed the little picture, those are little kids down in the lower corner, but a rival art student, Piero Torrigiano, breaks his nose. He's fed up with Michelangelo, sort of strutting around like this. And so he takes a swing at him. And for the rest of his life, Michelangelo, as you can see in the lower left picture, has a crooked nose, a broken nose. It made, as he said, it made my nose feel like a biscuit beneath my knuckles. And it did not sweeten his temper, did not make him an easier person to live with. And the picture, as you can see, shows him with the broken nose for the rest of his life. And the little picture on the right, there's Torrigiano up above, looking rather annoyed with everything that's going on. He never achieves the kind of fame that he wanted, but he does achieve some minor notoriety by breaking Michelangelo's nose. At the time, this is in the late 15th century, the late 1490s, these years, Michelangelo was influenced by the monk Savonarola, and that's a whole story in itself. Savonarola is a Dominican friar from Ferrara and a preacher who becomes very active in Florence. At one point, he takes over the government for a year or two. Savonarola is known for his prophecies of civic glory, the destruction of secular art and culture, and his calls for Christian renewal. Sounds a little bit familiar in some ways to today's world. He denounces clerical corruption, despotic rule, the exploitation of the poor. Savonarola intervenes with the French king. The Florentines are expelled. The ruling Medicis are kicked out. Michelangelo often goes to hear Savonarola's fiery gospel of Puritan reform. The Florentines can't take this. And I think it was in the 1499, 1500, Savonarola is burned at the stake along with several of his colleagues. So he overreaches, but Michelangelo is influenced by Savonarola, and as we will see in some of his paintings, this comes out later. He later, as I noted here, would remember his preachings when he was painting the Last Judgment, Descent into Hell, which is this very dramatic picture that he paints in the Vatican a number of years later. Savonarola is burned, I was wrong, the date is 1498, and the church and his whole secular rule are condemned. He's hanged, and then he's burned, and I won't go into more details on that, but memories of Savonarola do affect Michelangelo in a number of ways for the rest of his life, especially when he's working in the Sistine Chapel. Lorenzo dies in 1492. This is a picture of the sleeping Cupid, sculptured in 1496. He's still in Florence at this point. Lorenzo has died. Michelangelo goes to work for another collateral branch of the Medici family. And in 1496, he sculpts this sleeping Cupid. He then, or an accomplice, buries it in acidic earth to give it an appearance of great age. The plan was to pass it off as an antique, which would allow it to fetch a higher price. The Cupid was a significant work in establishing the reputation of the young Michelangelo. It was later bought by Isabella, Queen Isabella of Spain, and it's really the breakthrough sculpture for Michelangelo in his career that makes people really recognize it. Florence, however, political turmoil in Florence and better opportunities elsewhere caused Michelangelo to go to Rome. So in the late 15th century, he goes to Rome. Florence is less able than before to offer large commissions. Lorenzo is no longer there, and leading Florentine artists such as Leonardo and Leonardo's teacher, Andrea del Verrocchio, move away to go to other cities. The Medici, are overthrown even before the end of the political turmoil surrounding Savonarola. So this just shows you a picture of these young toughs in Florence on the streets, causing somebody to do battle with each other. And a lot of people left the town at that point. Okay, now I've got a few things to say about this. The Pietà, you probably Many of you have seen this. It was in New York, wasn't it, years ago? Didn't it come to World's Fair? Came to the Metropolitan. I think I saw it there. But it's an interesting piece. And at this point, Michelangelo is now as a known figure. He's known in 1497, a cardinal, a French cardinal, commissions Michelangelo to create a work of sculpture which would go in a side chapel at the old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. At this point, we're still talking about the old St. Peter's. It's not rebuilt yet. The Sistine Chapel has not yet been decorated. The resulting work, this Pietà, would be so successful that it really makes Michelangelo an international figure at this point. It launches his career if it wasn't already launched. Unlike previous work he has done, the scene of the Pietà shows the Virgin Mary holding the dead body of Christ after the crucifixion, after his removal from the cross. She's not at the bottom, he's not up on the cross, she's not down below. It's at that point, at least, it's a very unique look. And there's some other things about it that are rather unusual too, which maybe some of you will see, but we'll talk about that in a minute. To prepare for this and for his other pieces of sculpture, Michelangelo spends long periods of time exploring nearby quarries. These were like religious experiences for Michelangelo. He would look around and find a perfect piece of marble. What can I use this for? When he knew what his commission was. The quarries, his favorite quarries, are Carrara, about 60 miles from Florence, 60 miles northwest of Florence. And Carrara marble had been used ever since the time of ancient Rome. So it's not a discovery, and as you can say in the title of this book, Michelangelo's Mountain, the quest for perfection in the marble quarries of Carrara. So he spends a lot of time, as much time there as he does actually doing his sculpting for a long time. Now let's look at previous pictures of a Pietà. Previous ones have been almost exclusively carved in wood. And they looked a little more grotesque in some ways. And Michelangelo's challenge when he was given this commission by the French cardinal is to do this in marble and adopting it to the wood, adopting the wood to the marble motif, which he does. But look, you can see these various, the Madonna is holding Christ in her arms, but his sculpture is going to be different. And there's a picture of the Madonna right here. Previous virgins' heads were painfully distorted in these more Gothic Pietàs. Instead of grief, in the one Michelangelo does, Mary's expression is one of resignation. The success of this Pietà brings Michelangelo not only fame, but money, and his family descends upon him. It's like you're a professional athlete today and you win a big contract and all of your relatives suddenly come out of the woodwork and want a handout. And this happens with Michelangelo. And he makes a certain amount, he makes a comfortable living doing this. He has 3 brothers, he has his parents, his father now suddenly pulls a switch and is very proud of his son after all this, which is done in the early 16th century, the early 1500s. The colleagues in Rome were said to express disbelief that such a young and relatively unknown sculptor could create such a work. He was 23 years old when he does this, and I've showed you a couple of different pictures of it. Around the time the work was finished, however, there was a complaint against Michelangelo because of the way he depicted the Virgin. Now, how does he depict? Take a look at this. How is he depicting the Virgin? Yes, she's not, she's maybe not as grief-stricken as you might think. She was too young. She was so young. Was a concern. How could she be the mother of a 33-year-old son? If that was Jesus' age when he was crucified, approximately. Michelangelo didn't care much for beauty. He cares only for bodies, preferably male. And so he really concentrates on the body of the dead Christ, which we'll look at a little more here. The Virgin appears so large that if she stood up, she would tower over her son. I mean, take a look at the proportions on this. She's huge. An examination of each figure reveals that their proportions are not entirely natural in relation to the other one. Although their heads are in proportion, the Virgin's body is much larger than Christ's body. She appears to be so large, if she stood up, I said she would tower over her son. And Michelangelo always admires the naked beauty of young men, which is why most of his sculptures are of nude males. So the Pietà is admired, it makes his reputation, but people can always find something to criticize, even in this case, and they do. And why is Mary so big, Christ smaller? It was the kind of thing that the nitpickers feasted on. Notice Michelangelo's signature on a diagonal ribbon that is carved across the Virgin Mary's chest. And you can see that in the lower slide on the right, you can see his signature. It's the only work, at least that I've discovered, that he's ever signed of all of his things that he does. The critics said also there was an excessive amount of drapery on Mary and her head was too small for her body. So that's those are the critics, but most people thought it was a spectacular achievement, especially for a young man who was 23 years old, and it's been admired obviously ever since. Michelangelo begins to prosper. He's left is a picture of him done by, I think it was Ingres in the 19th century in his studio. There's Michelangelo there, pictures of him in his studio. The success of the Pietà brings him fame and fortune, and he supports his family. He complained that he was too generous to them. He's not the easiest guy to live with, as I've said. Because of his tangled finances, he returns to Florence, where he was given a unique assignment. This is in 1501. He says, "It's ridiculous. I want to go back to where I came from, back to Florence, where I made my name." And what is the unique experience that he has, the unique commission? It's the David. Now, let's take a look at the different statues, the different ways in which David had been portrayed in the last century before Michelangelo. What you're looking at is on the left, statues by Verrocchio, and then two by Donatello, the two which bracket David's or Michelangelo's in the middle, and then Bernini over on the right, who does a later one. So he has those to sort of guide him. And he has given an old piece of marble to work on. It's been sitting out for years. Somebody sort of began to do some work on it, but then that fell apart. Donatello's was done, the one on the far left here is done in 1409. That is done in 1409 right there. And wait a minute. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Verrocchio's is right here. That was done recently in 1470 or something. Donatello's, both are done in the middle 14 or early 1400s. This is done in 1409 right here. This one is done and reworked in 1416. And then Bernini over here in the next century. And then this one right here, let me back up. This one on the left is a one by Verrocchio, which is much more recent. And there's even some thought that maybe Leonardo was the model for this as a young man. That's not been proven, but that's a theory, a possible theory. Remember that David now is the symbol of the Florentine Republic. Like the Old Testament youth who stood up to his rivals, Florence is doing the same thing. And there's a disjunction in some of these statues between David's refined and graceful pose with the apparent reverie and beauty of the facial expression. And the gruesomeness of most of these other statues show the decapitated head of Goliath at his feet. And it's only the one on the far right, Bernini's David, that can be considered the culmination of technical achievement. I'll talk about that in a minute. So he takes off for Carrara again. He's given this commission, and he comes back and he realizes that his best bet is to use a piece of marble that somebody had already tried to cut a little bit out of, but couldn't go anywhere. Michelangelo is notoriously picky about what he's going to use here. And for the David statue, as I said, he makes use of a block that other artists had deemed unworkable. This is known as the giant. This piece of marble had been sitting out for nearly 70 years in some lot in the part of Florence, and had been abandoned. A series of sculptures that people who tried to work on it had not gotten very far. And Michelangelo reuses this block that had been left unfinished for 40 years before. Now here we go on the work, the way this work is done. I mean, look at the size of these statues compared to men that are nowadays up there on scaffolding, cleaning it and working on it. You can imagine if Michelangelo could be up here on scaffolding all around the statue, working on it, standing back, coming down. How many of you in here at this point have ever seen the statue? Well, at least half the room. It's remarkable. The original is indoors, and there's copies are all over the place, but the original is indoors. It takes him 2.5 years to do this, and the statue soon comes to symbolize the defense of civil liberties embodied in the Republic of Florence, which is an independent city-state threatened on all sides by more powerful rival states. It's the whole idea of Goliath, and David, the weaker, supposedly the weaker figure in the whole situation. Michelangelo chooses to depict David before, not after his victory. He hasn't killed Goliath yet. You can look at his expression. And one thing I've noticed about this is I look at different pictures of it, and as I remember from seeing it up close, from different angles, you see different expressions. And what is the expression as you look at these two that the common man or woman sitting down below sees in David? How is he expressing himself? What would you say? Anybody?
Determination.
Determination. Concentration. And why does he have Michelangelo emphasizing this particular mood, do you think? We are the common people standing looking up at this great figure, and it'll give us confidence. It shows that David seems to be able to think he can handle the situation. And when we look closer at this, we'll look at it from a different angle. You'll see maybe what Goliath saw. But see, we're going to look at that. Yes. Okay. Yeah, we will. Seen from the perspective of the average man, as he watches Goliath approach, I said, what is his mood? Is he confident? Yeah, he looks pretty confident. Wouldn't you say in this picture? Wary. Well, there's different emotions. Michelangelo's David has become one of the most recognized works of the Renaissance. It's a symbol of strength and youthful beauty. The colossal size of the statue impresses his contemporaries and everybody who sees this. But there he is, looking at his opponent. The sling is slung over his shoulder, and we'll look at the picture, the actual picture of the dramatization of this little kid going to sling a stone by a Goliath. And that's on the left. You can see him here. The pose of Michelangelo's David is unlike those of earlier Renaissance depictions. The bronze statues by Donatello and Verrocchio represent the hero standing over the head of Goliath. And Castagno has shown the boy in mid-swing, even as Goliath's head rests between his feet. I guess that's the picture in the insert up in here. No earlier Florentine artist that I can find had omitted the head of Goliath. It was a much more conventional approach, and Michelangelo's David is going to be different. Now, here's what Goliath sees. What does Goliath see? David's a little worried, maybe?
I'm not afraid.
I'm not afraid. Well, that's though his eyes, of course, have changed now, distorted. I would say there's a furrowed brow there that we should not ignore. I'd say he's a little more anxious. He's trying to be brave as he looks into the eyes, but this is not a view that the average person is going to see. You got to remember that. This is why I find it such an interesting piece of work that Michelangelo has created here. His expression, anxiety, confidence, glaring, maybe tense with anticipation. Every angle that you see is a little bit different. The angles that you're looking at this, which makes it remarkable. And then, of course, this is really remarkable picture of his hand. What do you see in this? What's the suggestion here? Yeah. Somebody raise their hand over there. What do you see in his hand? What's this representing? Well, what's in the hand? Can you see anything in the hand here? Let me see here. Is he holding I think he's right in here. Isn't he holding something right there? Holding a stone, probably, or some sort of a thing in his sling. And here's his hand. This is a distorted hand. This is much grotesque. This is a great big hand, even compared to David's hand. This is huge. It's a weapon. It's a weapon in itself that Michelangelo is emphasizing, and that's not something that previous sculptors, as I've showed you, are able to do here. So it's a weapon in itself. It holds the stone or whatever he's going to put in his sling, and it shows obviously a different view of it. And Vasari said it surpasses all other statues, ancient and modern, Latin or Greek. Vasari gives it the #1 billing at this point. Is this the torso of a shepherd boy?
No.
Hardly. The statue is heroic. Much as Michelangelo, and it sort of illustrates how much Michelangelo loves the nude male body. It was immediately celebrated as one of the great masterpieces of the Renaissance. He was paid 400 florins, which is about $5,000 in 1950 money, as close as I could come. So maybe 25,000, 20,000 in today's money, which isn't much for 2 years of such closed up work. So this is the body that Michelangelo conceives of. Now, Paul, would you read these facts?
It's roughly the height of an adult giraffe, 17 feet, and it weighs 12,500 pounds. There are 30 life-size replicas of David around the world. David predates Michelangelo. It was merely a rough slab of marble for 35 years, approximately, deemed unusable for a sculptor until Michelangelo worked his magic. Michelangelo chose to break with tradition with David, creating the statue without including the head of Goliath. The statue is disproportionate because of the marble block, which was previously deemed unworkable. The statue of David is slightly cross-eyed, maybe intentionally. The statue of David embodies the city of Florence, symbolizing independence and strength in the perfect image of youthful beauty.
Okay, well, we've talked about this, so I think you see why this is such a remarkable piece of work. Now, a few little sidebars here. Last week, I ended by talking about Michelangelo's rivalry with Leonardo. Despite the two artists' intense personal dislike, each begrudgingly respects the other. Didn't help that Leonardo had argued that the genitals of David should be covered with a, quote, decent ornament. And he got his way. they stayed that way for 40 years. So here's a picture of David being properly covered here. Leonardo had, Michelangelo observed Leonardo's paintings, and although it was this taste between the two, it appears that Michelangelo was just jealous of Da Vinci's artwork, and this inspires inspiration and competition between the two of them. In 1873, the statue of David was moved from the Piazza del Signoria to the Galleria dell'Accademia, and moving Michelangelo's heroic statue of David from the piazza, where it stood for 300 years, it stood outdoors, to be moved inside. So there it is, a picture of it being moved, and I'll just show you a brief clip of this. Wait a minute here.
In 1464, a minor sculptor began to rough out an enormous block of marble for the Opera del Duomo, but had to abandon the work almost immediately because of the difficult proportions of the stone. In 1501, Michelangelo accepted the commission to complete the David and worked on it for 2 years. Later, a committee of citizens and artists, after a heated debate, decided to set up the statue on the ringhiera or podium outside Palazzo dei Signori. Beginning on the 14th of May, 1504, the journey of about 600 meters from the courtyard of the Opera del Duomo to Palazzo dei Signori was made with extreme caution in 4 days, during which some unpleasant and envious youths threw stones at the statue. Giorgio Vasari describes the David suspended from hempen ropes inside a wooden structure.
They made a very strong wooden cage and suspended that figure with hempen ropes from it, so that it should not break with the shocks, but fall continually.
Okay, well, that illustrates the moving of it, and which they were able to do after 300 years. Today, a replica also stands outside the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, and it's balanced by another statue that was commissioned of Hercules killing Caucasus outside the Palazzo to provide a balance, basically, to the entrance to this historic building. They decided that David would be installed in the front and as a symbol of the Florentine Republic. So there, that's what you see today, at least. That's the last time I've seen it. That's the way it's set up. A century later, Bernini would go further with a 3-dimensional statue. And these are pictures all of Bernini's statue in 1624, different from Michelangelo's David and other sculptures, in the way it challenges the viewer to walk around the sculpture to view the energy and movement that this piece is engaging with the viewer. The frowning and biting of his lower lip is twisted and a fiercely concentrated expression. It needs space. Before this, sculptures did not have the movement that Bernini's illustrates here. In 1505, he's finished the David. He's been up in Florence for several years. He's summoned finally back to Rome to design Pope Julius's tomb. And theirs, as I said at the beginning, theirs was a turbulent relationship. The two men were so alike, bad-tempered, temperamental, neither acknowledging as superior, not compromising. They stamped their personalities on their times. Julius chose his papal name not in honor of Julius I, but in emulation of Julius Caesar. One of the most powerful and influential popes, Julius was a central figure of the High Renaissance and leaves a significant cultural and political legacy. And here is Michelangelo over here on the left, median, and there's Michelangelo in the middle, and Pope Julius over here on the right. So you're going to come and work for me. I don't want to hear any nonsense, no back talk. And Michelangelo said, yeah, well, we'll see about that. And they have a very difficult relationship. So he begins work on Julius's tomb, which is originally intended to be in St. Peter's. But then they decide, St. Julius says, I'm going to redesign St. Peter's. I'm going to upgrade it. And so Julius's tomb is actually never in St. Peter's, but that was his vision. He had died before they get to that actual stage. Michelangelo is now 33. He's done David. He has not yet done the Sistine Chapel, and he begins work on Julius's tomb in marble. Now it's a relatively obscure piece located in San Pietro in the Holy Church.
That's Moses.
That is Moses, yeah. Yeah. But I mean, it's all he decorates the whole thing. There's 40 different statues that he decorates. Julius is in there. Here's some early designs of what, say, he wants the tomb to look like, and it's just sort of as a part of St. Peter's. And just to sort of show you some of the preliminary drawings that he does. Julius dies in 1513, but Michelangelo will continue work until 1545. And the tomb is now in a nearby church. That doesn't make the cut as far as making it to St. Peter's. It was an ongoing project, as I said, not until long after the Pope's death. Michelangelo works on it intermittently from 1505 for 40 years, 1505 to 1545. Its time is stopped in the middle of that because we have the Reformation. We have the Counter-Reformation, all other political and religious changes are going on in Europe at this point. Rome is sacked in 1527 by the French. They come down, and the final version is greatly reduced in size. It was one of the great disappointments of Michelangelo's life when the Pope unexpectedly said, I want you to stop and work on something else, which we'll see what you imagine what that is. Here's Pope before he tells him to stop. He often visits Michelangelo in his studio. Hey, how's it going? You know, hey, what's happening here? And Mike, you could just hear Michelangelo saying, "Get the bleep out of here." He didn't want to suffer this. And here is him working on one of his various statues. Here's the Pope approaching through the door with cardinals behind him. And it's marvelous. It captures the moment in many ways. That's how it was worked. The architect for the revised St. Peter's is another artist named Bramante, who, along with Leonardo, was one of Michelangelo's chief rivals. When Julius engages Bramante for the grandest European architectural commission of the century, the 16th century, which is a complete rebuilding of St. Peter's, he asks him, so who's going to do some of the work, the sculptures or the frescoes on the ceiling and everything? And Bramante suggests Michelangelo, thinking that he won't accept this challenge. There's a lot of sort of back and forthism between these two men. They're obviously jealous of each other, and Michelangelo surprises everybody by agreeing to do it. So the Sistine Chapel, another of Julius's projects, rebuilding the Vatican, has begun. And here is Bramante showing the Pope some of the drawings of this right here. And here's Michelangelo. Here's the Pope. There's Michelangelo right there in black. And then a youthful figure over here on the right is Raphael, who's going to have a lot to do. And again, if this was a longer course, I'd spend much more time on Raphael. But he is shown looking over Bramante's shoulder here, as Bramante tries to show the Pope what some of these ideas are. And they didn't really take Michelangelo at first seriously because he was a sculptor. And Bramante didn't think he could do any of the kind of fresco decorations that, of course, he ends up doing him. And Bramante gets very jealous of Michelangelo, who will soon replace him as the Pope's favorite artist. When he asks Michelangelo to switch gears and decorate the Sistine ceiling. He accepts very reluctantly. And he spends 4 years of his life perched on a scaffolding with his brush and fresco implements in hand. He will return intermittently to Julius's tomb over the next several decades, but it's not, that's one reason that Julius is constantly changing his demands. And it's not something that Michelangelo was able to keep up with all the time. One thing, he considers himself mainly a sculptor, not a painter. He has no experience with frescoes. And he had his heart set originally on finishing the tomb. Nevertheless, he reluctantly accepts the commission and spends his time up on the scaffold, as you can see here, working on it. Here's a picture of the Sistine Chapel before Michelangelo was ordered to redecorate it. So it's got lots of decorations already, the walls, and a lot of this has already been decorated with stars. The ceiling has been, it's hard to see it here, but, and I've only been to the Sistine Chapel once. It was crowded, but apparently the ceiling is the size of 2 tennis courts. Does that make sense? Many of you have seen it here, but it's a large one, and no wonder it takes so long for him to do it. It's done between 1508 and 1512 by Michelangelo. And it's huge chapel built with the Vatican, by the Vatican between 1477 and 1488. His masterpiece, the Sistine ceiling, is almost an afterthought by the Pope. I mean, those are the two great, David and the Sistine ceiling are obviously totally different, but it shows the genius of Michelangelo. It has great symbolic meaning for the papacy. As the chief consecrated space in the Vatican, which is used for great ceremonies such as electing and inaugurating new popes. It already contains distinguished wall paintings, and Michelangelo was asked to add works for this relatively unimportant ceiling at this time. As I said, the ceiling was too large, as big as 2 tennis courts. Bramante had suggested Michelangelo thinking to the Pope, thinking that he couldn't do this, that he wouldn't do it. But Michelangelo accepts the challenge. And here's the centerpiece, the creation of Adam. He's 37 years old when the project was finished in 1512. 37, he will live to be 89 years old. And this is all the scenes in the center are from the book of Genesis. And in this fresco, we see God giving life to Adam, reaching out with his finger. Other figures in there, probably Eve under God's arm right here. Right here, that's Eve right there. The Christ child, it's somewhat speculative, angels around this. It's a very complex scene with many layers of symbolism. Prompting many people to ask what it was he tried to achieve. And all of his scenes have these sort of complex messages that they're sending here. And then, of course, all of them illustrating the nude body, male nude body especially, except for God, who's got a sheet draped across him. Just want to give you a little touch of this.
We're in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, which has tremendous importance to Catholicism. This is where the Pope will lead Mass, but perhaps most famously, this is the room that the College of Cardinals uses to decide the next Pope.
And every surface of this space is decorated from the beautiful.
All right, okay.
Even we can't hear it. Yes.
Why not, but.
We're in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, which has tremendous importance to Catholicism. This is where the Pope will lead Mass, but perhaps most famously, this is the room that the College of Cardinals uses to decide the next Pope.
And every surface of this space is decorated, from the beautiful mosaics on the floor. The walls are painted with frescoes by early Renaissance artists. The wall behind the altar was painted by Michelangelo later in his life. And then, of course, the ceiling.
And everybody is looking up. Their necks are craned, and of course, it's magnificent. We're here in the late afternoon on a day in early July. The light is diffuse, and it makes those frescoed figures feel so dimensional. They feel like sculpture.
And you can imagine what it was like when this was unveiled in 1512, after Michelangelo had worked on it for years, how different, how revolutionary Michelangelo's figures seemed.
Well, he was first and foremost a sculptor.
I want to move on because we're getting a little short here. And Raphael appears on the scene in 1504, where the style is influenced by his predecessors, Bartolomeo, Leonardo, and Michelangelo. Raphael is a very young man at this point, 24, has risen into great recognition as a painter, and his works, well, are more strictly in accordance with the rules of art than Michelangelo's. They're graceful in coloring and beauty, beautiful intervention, and admirable in expression. And this all makes Michelangelo jealous. Here's somebody else he can be jealous about. And I want to show you one of the great works that Raphael produces, the School of Athens. At the age of 26, Raphael is invited by the Pope, Pope Julius, to decorate his private library wall in the Vatican Palace. And the fresco is the result. And Raphael beats competitors such as Michelangelo and Leonardo to win the commission, and he gains rapturous reviews. Above, as the School of Athens illustrates this. And you can see, I think, I'll show you here. You can see the two central figures are Plato and Aristotle right here. I'm just going to show you the next one. It illustrates it a little bit more. The two figures, Raphael paints a total of 50 scholars in the School of Athens. And these are classical philosophers, scientists, mathematicians, and they're seen sharing their ideas and learning from each other. The two central figures are widely recognized as Plato, which has the face of Leonardo, and Aristotle. Plato, the older man, and on the left is pointing to the heavens and holding a copy of his book. Down below, you can see Pythagoras right here, who's the great mathematician, and then with this pointer here. And this is a picture of Michelangelo right here on the lower left. I'm pointing my pointer. And then over here on the far right, we see this little figure right here of Raphael right there. He gets himself into the picture just a second in on the right one. And then I will show you this picture, which illustrates everything. I don't know whether you can see the names. Can you see the names of this somewhat? This wall of philosophy, the gathering of great minds from ancient Greece, Spain, and Persia, and Rome. And it was all long been seen by a lot of people figure this is Raphael's masterpiece. Perfect embodiment of the classical spirit of the Renaissance that you can see maybe now where Michelangelo fits in down below in here. Where's my pointer? And anyway, you can see, you can recognize all the names that Raphael has recognized as included in here. For the rest of his life, this is finished when he's 37 years old. The rest of his life, much of Michelangelo's work consists of completing projects like the Medici tombs and the Last Judgment on the wall of the Sistine Chapel. The older he gets, the graver the mood of his work becomes. Medici tombs, Lorenzo and Julian, the Last Judgment, which he paints as a 50-year-old. The immediate occasion for the chapel was the death of two young family heirs named Giuliano and Lorenzo after their forefathers. And he pays attention to this. And then this last picture here is of the Last Judgment, which depicts the second coming of Christ, as well as God's final and eternal judgment. Christ is surrounded by many prominent saints. And I just saw this as I was reading and preparing for this, but everybody on the left side is climbing, ascending. If you can see that, and everybody on the right side is descending. You probably can't see this, and most of them, of course, are nude male bodies. But this depicts the last judgment of like what happens to the people over on the right who are going to go down to hell. Michelangelo's final and unfinished sculpture was a recently discovered Pieta Ronaldini, which refers to where it was found in Rome, the Palazzo Ronaldini in Rome. Final sculpture revisits the theme of the Virgin Mary mourning over the body of the dead Christ. It's housed in the Museum of Art at the Strozzi Castle today and Sforza Castle today in Milan. Michelangelo was working on this piece at the age of 89 when he suddenly dies. He's dead within 3 or 4 days and ending a brilliant career. Okay, now I have time for, I'd like to have some questions if anybody has any comments or questions about what we've seen tonight. Obviously, we've covered a lot of material, but anybody like to comment on this? Yeah, question.
Where was the last sculpture discovered?
It was in the Piazza del Ronaldini in Rome. It was in Rome, and then it's been transported up to Milan today, which is where it's housed indoors. Yeah, or I don't really know all the details about it. It was found unearthed, from what I can tell. Not really, nobody knew much about it. I mean, maybe it's, I don't really know more than that. It was simply found and certainly untreated. Yeah, Larry.
Thanks for what a great introduction. Very interesting. The only comment I want to make, when I think of Michelangelo, the 3 sculptures that people talk about are the Pietà, David, and Moses. So I didn't realize that Moses is only part of Julius'
Yeah, yeah.
You have to go to this out of the way church to see.
Yeah, yeah, it's a brilliant piece of work. I can focus on that as being one of his major accomplishments, but obviously it is.
I don't know, I'm not an artist.
Yeah,
It just
yeah.
seems to be the one that gets referred to.
Well, he's very complicated. And look at the variations in his career. Look at his head. And anything else? I don't want to, yes, question over there.
In what way would you say that either Michelangelo and Leonardo embody the spirit of the Renaissance or taken together?
Well, I think both of them are, unlike the earlier Renaissance, which I talked about in one of the first classes, look back for their inspiration. Michelangelo certainly uses classical themes, but he's looking ahead to create new. The question is, how do these 2 men embody the spirit of the Renaissance? And these 2 men look forward to new ways of maybe creating old models. I mean, they certainly use classical and biblical examples, but they're looking forward as opposed to trying to recreate what was done back in classical Greece or Rome. And that's the best answer I can give. Dora?
Do we know, is there any speculation if there was a model for David?
Not that I know of. I honestly, there very well may have been, but he's so unusually portrayed. You have to be a player from the Eagles or something to be a model. I don't think, I don't know, has anybody ever heard of a model for David? I'm not, I expect to me that he.
Well, like Michelangelo, like Leonardo da Vinci, I think, didn't he dig up a lot of bodies? Wasn't he in trouble for all the bodies he exhumed to study their muscles and their.
Michelangelo or Leonardo was.
Well, didn't Michelangelo as well?
That I'm familiar with. Not as much, certainly. If he did it, it was not as much of a. So,
Harry, was there any discussion about the horns on Moses? If you could, if not, could you just put that image on the screen?
let's take a look at this again here.
Because many of these folks sitting here have suffered in their lives because of that.
Back, I'll keep going back.
Yeah, we'll go back to Moses. It's important.
Yeah.
There.
Okay.
Notice the horns on top of his head. It is because of this sculpture that historically non-Jewish people thought that Jews had horns.
Oh, okay.
And I personally experienced this when I was in college, when some young boy from an upstate New York town discovered that I was Jewish and asked me where my horns were. And I'm sure that other people have had similar experiences. Now, the explanation for this is that Michelangelo was taking from the Bible the rays of light that were emanating from Moses' head when he came down from the mountain. But he couldn't put rays on a sculpture, so he tried to, and wound up with horns.
Actually, Paul, the root,
Calvin.
the Hebrew root is the same for horns and for rays. And some earlier, after Moses encountered God in the second, when he brought down the second set of tablets, it says that his face shone with rays, Karan Panay, Karan or Panav, I think is the biblical phrase. And earlier translators, and that he covered his face with a veil after that. Earlier translators said that that horns emerged from his head, because it actually is the same root. It's keren. It can mean either ray or horn.
Okay, I can see we have at least another class worth of discussion. We will move on next week to the question of women and the role of women in the Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Harry.